yet? All right. Thanks all. Awesome. Well, Bonjour, Madame de Quendish, Costin Shanabe Que, Gagoon and Dem, Gittigans Bing and Gamig, Minwa, Chicago, Minwa, Gully Bay, and some other places too. I'm really just thank you to Dan and Susan for asking me to share some work that I've been up to for a while now, and I'm looking forward to conversation today. I'll try to monitor chat, but also you're welcome. I'm going to share some stuff and then I'm hoping we'll have a conversation, and you're welcome to ask questions in the middle or along the way. I am Ojibwe in Italian descent, and here is my lake. This is outside my house, a couple blocks. Just wanted to start to say that I'm calling in from Chicago, and often like to start with just acknowledging that I'm really excited to be here and to share work as an educator. I've been an educator for a long time now and think about education as really a place of transformation for our communities. And I always like to start with some ancestors and some babies, and just say that I started out as a preschool teacher, a Head Start teacher, and have taught in middle school and high school and in community settings. And I am a professor now, and I teach teacher education as well as superintendent and principal prep, and work with graduate students a lot on community-based research projects. And I'm really happy to say I continue to run community-based programs. I often say you shouldn't really teach people to do things that you can't do yourself. So you're gonna see me in some of this data, but I run programs in different communities throughout the year, and I continue to teach high school students. And for me as a scholar and a researcher, that's just been really important to kind of my own journey. So I thought what I was gonna do today a little bit is talk to you about some big ideas. And then I was just telling Dan and Susan that I know there's been extraordinary people in these things. So I'm gonna share a little bit of newer work around how we've been thinking about beginnings in learning environments and why we think beginnings and kind of the terms of beginnings when you begin a lesson or an activity or wherever we are matter, and what we've been learning about them. So hopefully that'll be useful for you all for a bit. I thought I'd start with kind of bigger picture. So for the last 25 years, I've been really after what does it look like for us to reclaim our own ways of educating, not just about or what, the what of education, but how to do it. And so I've really been after this idea of land and water-based education. And a long time ago, Vine Deloria talked about this and once said this in a room to me and a few others, that a version of this quote, but that Indigenous education is not Indigenous or education from within our intellectual traditions unless it comes through the land, unless it occurs in an Indigenous context using Indigenous processes. We should be reconcerned with recreating the conditions within which this learning occurred, not merely the content of the practice itself. Part of why this has been really important to me is because I think that most schooling is interested in the content, not the process so much. And so what I've been up to for the past 25 years or so is a long history of projects, partnerships with different tribal communities, both urban and rural reservation communities, redesigning our own learning environments on our own terms. And I've tended to do that just to say, because for me, one of the major things that I think a lot about is we're living in times of changing climate. And what does that mean for what we need for education? So these are kind of high level researchy questions, but you know, we live in interesting times and we live in really critical times. And so education needs to change in order to actually support young people growing and learning to thrive in the times that we are. So I think about that a lot. And for me, I have grandparents and parents-in-laws and great-grandparents that survived boarding schools. So I've also recognized that education is this site that has been the source of some of our greatest harms. And I really love the idea that it could also be, we could transform education to be medicine for our communities, the places in which we make the futures we want. But I think about this as a learning environment is a process of world making, that it's already always unfolding. And sometimes we think about like, okay, go to school, get an education, so then you can live your life, or then you can contribute. And I think that that's a mistake. So for me, the design of learning environments is a really important act of world making about the possibilities of now. I often say to people, I have a 5-year-old granddaughter. And if I think about what I hope she gets to tell the story of the world of her life in 90 years. And if I'm not thinking about what I'm teaching my 5-year-old now about the story of her life when she's an elder, then I'm probably forgetting what I need to put in motion now so the world can be different. And I often tell people, I really hope that the colonial trauma and entanglements that still seem to define our lives and our children's lives and their schooling experiences, she gets to tell the story of how that transformed, of how we've come to a new era. So I think about the design of learning environments in that way, and about the power that they have to make a whole bunch of decisions about like what should be learned, why it should be learned, how it should be learned, who should teach it, where learning should happen, what languages should we use when we teach and learn, what are our assessments, and so many more points of decision making that as educators and because of our systems, we often run roughshod over these really important decisions because systems have kind of set the terms. And I've been after saying, what does it look like for us to not accept those terms? And what a group of us, all of the work that I'm talking about today is not mine alone. It's a much larger effort. We've been trying to think about this idea about what is pedagogical sovereignty in practice. And Scott Lyons is a scholar that I love. He talks about sovereignty as the guiding story in our pursuit of self-determination. He goes on to talk about that he was talking about writing and what Indigenous peoples want from our writing. But he talks about this is that it's our need to decide for ourselves what our goals, our modes, our styles, our language, and that it's more than a renewed commitment. It's a radical rethinking of how and what we teach. For me, this how and not just the what, 25 years in, continues to be the persistent question about how is it that we best support the thriving of young people, see where they are, and learn new ways to do that. And in whose terms? Who gets to set those terms? And how are we participating and playing forward? And I guess what I'll say about this is how I was a teacher 20 years ago is really different than how I'm a teacher now. So some of this work is about my own trajectory about decolonizing my own practice, right? And continuing to recognize how I can do better as an educator. And to recognize, it's a funny thing, I get older and these kids seem to get younger, but they seem to have different experiences than the kids 20 years ago. So I'd also am recognizing that if I'm going to be a good educator, I have to continually learn and evolve, because the conditions of childhood, though some are stable and the same, also quite different. TikTok was not a thing 20 years ago. Right? So kids and children and childhoods are continuing to evolve. And so for me as an educator, I'm always thinking about that. I guess so that's kind of what I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit about today, show you how we've been after and pursuing the idea of pedagogical sovereignty, not just the what are we teaching, but the how, and how as educators are we continually reflecting on what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I think probably, though, it's important for you all to know that one of the major things that I think a lot about is what we call nature-culture relations. And what are the fundamental relational controls between human peoples and our lands and waters, or the natural world, that are embedded in our school systems that I've really been after transforming. And part of what I'll say about this is that because I said I care about things like climate change, human relationships to the natural world and the ways we run our communities writ large have to be transformed again. We don't live sustainably currently, whether it's because of plastics or fossil fuels or lots of things. But I think a lot about this, and there's lots of research to demonstrate that these fundamental relationships and construals of relations between people and lands and waters shape all kinds of thought. And it starts when you're in the womb all the way through adulthood. It also shapes how you make decisions, how you reason about problems, how you imagine solutions. So for me, this nature-cultural relations is kind of the way that I've talked about it. One of the things that is important, I think, to recognize, and this is a model, I've thought about it as apart from models or a part of models, and sort of studied this in many different ways. And this box on the right is an example of that. The part on the left is the apart from model. People call it human supremacy or human exceptionalism, but it sets up that all life forms are for human entitled use. And there are lots of people in lots of different fields that talk about that's how we ended up in the Anthropocene. So other life is for our use. And that's really antithetical to most Indigenous, at least most that I know about, don't want to say all, but most Indigenous teachings, those were not our original instructions about how to be in right relations with our more than human kin. So, but when we think about this, schools and the ways that schooling has become normalized, not just for Indigenous children, but all children, has pulled kids away from our lands and waters and put them inside buildings where there's not very much of the more than human natural world. And in fact, we know that the average American child spends only 4 to 7 minutes a day in unstructured outdoor times compared to hours in the 1950s. For Native children, it's a little bit better. But the point is, over the last 50 to 70 years, human beings in industrialized nations like the United States are spending less and less time in the natural world. That's even true in rural places. It's less true, but I just want to say it's even true in rural places. Have a lot of new relationships with digital technologies that are starting to impact this. But it also is the case that we created a school system based on this. And for me, what I've been after, and as an example, is we've scaled a system of lab-based science, not field-based science. Science is not only lab tables like this where you're doing chemistry. In fact, some of the coolest scientists in the world are actually out in our wild rice beds, figuring out how to restore monomen or figuring out what's happening with runoff in different places. But our US system set up lab science as the exemplar of science. And I've really been after transforming that and imagining what would it mean for us to have field-based or field-based or land-based education as the model of K-12 education. And that's what I've been up to for a long time now. And I think it's probably important for people to know there are deep correlations between time outdoors and mental and physical health. I am concerned about increasing mental health challenges of Indigenous youth, but all youth. And what we are increasingly seeing is that actually outdoor time changes your biochemistry in ways that are correlated with your mental health too. Not just you're in better fitness, it literally changes your microbial makeup if you're too far away from the natural world for too long. So there are all these reasons that I think a lot about what it looks like to restore right relations between learning, people, and our lands and waters. And that's what I kind of do. So what I thought, that's kind of big picture stuff. I thought I'd give you an example because that's might all sound good, but how do you actually do it? And I'm going to pull from a project. This is we're actually in new iterations of this. So this is a little bit of older data, but new analyses that I'm going to show you a little bit. And where we really were after, we developed with a couple of tribal communities what we call Indigenous STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. And really thinking about the learning environments that our communities wanted for our kids without the constraints of schooling as it is, right? That invitation to how would you want your kids to learn without any of the rules that you feel like you have to follow, it's actually a hard thing to do at first, we find, for lots of people, because we've been working within constraints and it kind of constrains our imagination. But in these projects, we actually take time and we implement and we do things maybe not so great the first time and try again. And so that's sort of what we call co-design. And what I'm going to show you today is a little bit of story about one, how we tend to design learning in outdoor spaces, and then a little bit about one of the major things that's become really visible about what's different in these learning environments compared to when I'm in school-based classrooms, and think a little bit about how we could be doing both. So one thing I'll tell you is when I talk about land-based education, I'm not talking about field trips. We are 100% outdoors in these programs, come rain or shine or extreme heat, we figure it out. And so what I'm seeing is people are taking up land-based education, but what they mean is field trips. And there is something that happens when you learn to live on the land for multiple days in a row with kids rather than visit a place once. It also turns out that's not how field-based scientists do their work. They don't go to their field sites once to learn deeply about a place. So if we think about it in that way, you have to have multiple visits to a place to build deep relations. And we actually went from about 80% outdoors to 100% outdoors. And I am fully convinced that like 100% outdoors and dealing with all of the elements, even for a few weeks in a summer program, transforms things. I don't know that it's possible to do it all the time for all schools, but something shifts when kids we get to regularly be outdoors. So in this particular learning environment, I'll tell you a little bit about what we designed and what the structure was. So this was for 4th through 12th graders. There were, depending upon the year, between 40 and 60 students in this particular program. And what we were really after that community helped articulate is how are our homelands and waters in the Puget Sound being impacted by climate change and ocean acidification? And what should we do? What are our responsibilities? And the second question is not always something that we give children the opportunity to think about, right? They're supposed to be able to answer the first question, but creating learning environments that ask them to think about what should we do and how do we fulfill our responsibilities, simple questions, but not always what happens in learning. And you'll see why that matters over time. And in these learning environments, we did things like we studied biodiversity, ecological systems, uses, impacts and challenges in the homelands. They learned about land and water management, kind of what was happening with tribes and how they were doing those things. And we really tried to engage kids in thinking about what we call ethical deliberation decision-making, right? It's the second part of this question. How did they have to think hard about what this meant and what they should do? And in these projects, we study student learning, but we also study educator learning and pedagogical practices. And that second part I'm going to try to show you today. So I'm going to give you a couple of, part of what I think is also important to know is, so what's it look like? It's really high level. I'm going to show you some data too. In our programs, we always start with stories, songs, and prayer. Always. We always start there. And here are some dimensions. You don't need to hold all these, but we were often after remaking our relations, our relatives, our kin with other than humans, as well as each other. And we engage kids in things like observation and explanation. They did some studies. They also did things like engage in harvesting practices or contributed to restoration work. They learned about the kinds of challenges and resiliencies that were happening in the Pacific Northwest and what that meant about how their lands and waters were shifting. And we always engaged in art making. And we meant that pretty expansively, whether it's story work or it's traditional arts or it's contemporary arts. But part of what we were deliberate about is that students always had to engage in making. And then they had to plan projects for the next year. Leadership projects that they were going to take up connected to this as a way to fulfill their responsibilities. So what I want to do is share with you a little bit about what a trajectory looked like and how we're starting to learn about, so what does beginnings really mean and how do you plan for them as educators? Hopefully I've given you enough to kind of dig in here. And one way that we've done this is, and this is really academic, but I'll just tell you, is that we've been trying to understand what does it mean to really see Indigenous knowledge systems and learning environments and help educators see what they need to put in motion. So you don't need to know these words except for to say that there is this piece about, usually we set up, and most states make teachers learn that they put the learning goals or the targets on a chalkboard now. What are you learning? We've been really after about making sure that, can we see foundations about what we believe to be true or what our ethics and values are and how we're going to learn these. So I'm going to tell you a story that is going to hopefully demonstrate some of this. And we call this our grandmother Cedar, Una and her friends. And we'll see where we get. So this particular storyline was really learning about cedar, forest ecosystems and climate change. And it was really about understanding the uniqueness of Western red cedar forests. And in this storyline, kiddos started with a traditional story called Grandmother Cedar that I'll say a little bit more about in a few minutes. They formed a relationship with cedar. They investigated and learned about cedar's roles in the environment. They did a series of observations and kind of some Western sciencey kinds of things around cedar trees. They learned about how climate change was impacting cedar forests and what it was that human communities, including tribes, as well as states or in Canada, were doing to support cedar forests. They learned to weave. We made bracelets and baskets. We also made cordage and fishnets. And then we decided what we do. So hopefully you're sort of seeing like, okay, I get the kind of arc of activity here. And we made a whole bunch of new sort of curricular materials that help support kids thinking. This is an example. We were really after kids understanding, not making sort of just what is the cedar tree's life cycle, but what is cedar's place in the forest. And this is an observation protocol that you can kind of see. They had to learn to see the forest canopy, the forest understory. They had to understand who cedar grew by. These are all things that actually foresters do, that scientists do. It's how they know cedar. It's not just here's the seed and then it grows and here's the cedar's life cycle. That when you're actually doing complex sciences, you're noticing all of these components, and we set up our curricular materials to do this kind of thing. So we learned all about cedar together, and we used it as a model for smaller groups of kids to learn about other culturally salient species that are important in forest ecosystems. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that unfolded. But in order to show you that piece, you need to know a little bit about the grandmother cedar story, because I'm going to show you some data and you need to know this enough about this story so you can catch it. So one of the reasons we start with our stories is because we think about stories as our theories. There are frameworks for how to know and be in the world, right? Indigenous stories aren't just fables, they're actually deep philosophy, and they're often deep explanations about how the world has come to be and what's important. So we always start there. And in this particular story, Grandmother Cedar story, Grandmother Cedar is lonely and wants relatives, and she prays to Creator. And she is eventually gifted a grandson. I'm not telling you the story right now. I'm telling you enough of it so you can recognize it. She's gifted a grandson to raise, and she raises that grandson. She protects him from too much sun by shielding him from the hot sun, or from too much wind blowing him over. She shields him from the wind or the rain so that rains don't flood him out or wash him away, or from other animals like deer from eating his new growth and not letting him get too strong. She also attends to his emotional well-being in this story. She calls over the birds to actually sing to her grandson and help him feel good in the world. And in the story, she grows old and weak and he grows strong. And if you all want to actually hear the story, you can easily find it online. It's part of the Washington State curriculum. But she grows old and weak and he grows strong. And in the end of the story, he ends up demonstrating reciprocity and kind of playing the same roles for the old grandmother tree that she did when he was young. Part of the reason that we love this story is this is an actual picture of what we call what is known as a nursery log. right? And there are young trees growing on that nursery log and being taken care of by those older trees that have fallen down. And so there's all this kind of beautiful ways that this story actually tells a story and a version of what is a remarkable phenomena in Western cedar forests. It also shows interspecies relations of caring, of competition and food, but also helping and reciprocity. So we did that. Fast forward about 12 to 15 hours of instruction, where kids have now done multiple investigations into multiple culturally salient species. And they're now doing something we call a plant relative walk, where these smaller groups have learned about all these different species. And they've spent time doing that. And now they're going to share what they've learned with other groups. And what I'm going to show you is two groups, a snippet of their exchange. One group is made up of a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 13-year-old. And the other group is a 9, 11, and 12-year-old. And one of the groups is teaching about big leaf maple. And it's a little ways in. And I'm going to show you kind of what happens spontaneously after they've taught the other group what they thought they were going to teach. And you can see kids' spontaneous thinking.
So when the leaves of the maple tree die, they fall on the ground and they compost, and that's really good soil for the rest of the plants. And over towards here, there's sproutlings. I'm not really sure what plant, but there's some of the eggs right here. Yes, right around. Yeah, they were helps in like that. Are you trying to push like that? Also not a building. They kind of like grandma cedar tree, they kind of shield the other one. Look at good.
But why did they grow in such non-straight ways? What?
I believe that's a way that's kind of, they're trying to help out other plants by moving around, having their trunk move around, so it will cover more areas.
It could also be
because they need more sun.
yeah. It's also
Yeah, they need more sun.
this spread out so that they can get more sunlight.
And they take it
More
from
leaves,
and so
more
that
trunks, you can more
also since they shield it off, when the leaves drop, it gives them, and also that the little don't burn up and they also don't drown in water. They die in no.
big ecosystem and a big set of cycles.
Yep.
Okay, so what I want, there's many things to catch about this, but one of the things that I think is important and what we see as a really important thing is that about 15 or 20 hours of instruction earlier is when Una heard the grandmother cedar tree story. And in a spontaneous question about why do you think trees are growing this way, as she is doing really sophisticated work around helping understanding ecological relations like tree life cycles, impacting soils, helps other plants. She pulls up this story as the framework for knowing. They're kind of like the grandma cedar tree. They're kind of shielding the other plants, right? And part of what we have seen is that when you start with those foundations and you start the beginnings with these stories and these frameworks that honors our knowledge systems, it spontaneously starts to show up in reasoning and work, learning work in different kinds of ways. What you'll notice is that the older kids end up actually giving a very Western science answer, because more leaves, more trunks equals more leaves equals more photosynthesis. After sort of Una gives the cultural framework and the systems explanation of what's happening here. And then they navigate back. And partly what I think is really important to notice about that is not that actually either are wrong. In fact, they get to pretty robust beginnings, but they're both present, right? Different ways of knowing. And what we are really excited about this is that the communal frame of helping actually brings out much more sophisticated understandings of interaction about what's happening in the forest ecosystem. And again, this is 15 or 20 hours earlier of instruction, spontaneously showing up. No one prompted her to say, connect it to the grandmother cedar story. So what we often talk about in this particular, and we started seeing this, is that Una actually taught us about how deeply important beginnings are and what they put in motion for resources for thinking and learning and sense making. And what we've been really after is now digging into more deeply, how do we see that? So what I'm going to try to do now is just transition, and I'll try to finish up in a couple minutes, is we've been thinking about this through these words of axiology, ontology, and epistemology. And axiology is just what do we value? What are our ethics? Ontologies is what do we believe to be true or real? And epistemology is like the what? What's the content knowledge? And we've been studying the beginnings of our learning environments now and trying to understand why they're different. And I'll just say, we've done this for a number of reasons. So I would argue that actually many of our communities emphasize beginning protocols and routine practice for a variety of reasons. It's actually a heightened thing in many of our communities. So we started thinking about like, actually, maybe we should be digging into this because this is what our communities do for things that are important to them. There's also a whole bunch of research that has demonstrated that the beginning of learning engagements or activities in classrooms have profound implication on how learning unfolds. In fact, most research will demonstrate that lower SES schools tend to start with following directions, not big ideas, and that there's never a catch up to those bigger ideas, as one example. And I've said this a couple of times now, but I'll just reinforce it. Often we start with what is learned, not why. So we often have classrooms that are really muted with kind of the what is real or true and what is important. And we would argue by extension, kind of the political nature of learning all the time that really reinforces a kind of Western perspective on things. So how have we studied these beginnings? And I'm going to show you a little bit more data, and then maybe we can have a conversation. We went to all these themes, and what we did is we created a data set. We have 47 lessons. And we created the beginning, middle, and sort of closing of it. And then we coded them. And we coded it in a bunch of different ways. So we looked at each of these, kind of what were our ethics, what were our knowledge systems, what was real, and what kinds of learning objectives. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we found, both using some empirical data, and then I'm going to show you an example again. So one of the things that's really interesting to us is in community created learning environments, the axiology or the ethics, the why does something matter, is articulated all the time by educators. That starting out by why, not just what, was actually the most important emphasis in learning environments that communities created. And we dug down into these to see what this really looks like in more detailed ways. And I'm going to tell you about 3 because these axiologies were really important. And one of the most important things was these ethics about what we've come to call roles, relations, responsibilities, and gifts. That educators were always narrating those 4 dimensions for young people. And why we think that really matters is that it helps young people imagine who they are, what their roles are, how they belong, how they matter, and often meets kind of the developmental needs that kids have and want and need. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here just to say, okay, so what are those ethics? I did this wrong. So what you can see here is that if we look at just that data, one of the things that is important here is this roles and those relations and responsibilities. I think we still have some work to do to help make sure that each children's gifts are really emphasized. But place and belonging through these kind of narratives are always present in our beginnings. And part of what I think why this really matters is that young people across all ages are trying to figure out these things and are looking for messages about this. And what we really think about this is that it's a kind of Indigenous ethics and a theory of child development, that helping them always learn their relations and responsibilities and how they enact those things in their roles actually really supports them in thriving. I think the other one that I want to show you, and I'm going to say more about this in a minute, is these are the spatial temporal togglings. And this is really connected to this mental health piece that I was talking about earlier. And that one of my beautiful colleagues, Emma Elliott, has really done a lot of incredible work about, is what we noticed around the temporalities, both the spatial kind of narratives of mattering, as well as the temporal that were present in our beginnings and those beginning introductions. And what I really want to point out here is that we have past, present, and future, and we have an attention to generations across time and space, as well as geographies or lands across time and space, and that family and community are always interwoven. Part of the point here is that when we've studied other learning environments, and when we look at things like standards, what is usually indexed around Native people in classrooms is our past. In fact, 50% of states in the United States don't teach about Native people at all. And those 50% of states that do, about 85% of standards in those states are pre-1900. Which mean what we've infrastructured is only narratives of our past, not our present and our future. And so for us, seeing that actually when you see community educators doing what they want, we see this generational across both past and present and future as a discursive pattern that they do, even if they're not thinking about it with sort of the same intention that I'm talking about right now. So what does this look like in practice? Here's an example of a beginning. And to be honest, this probably doesn't look all that much different than an indoor classroom, except for that we're outdoors. And I say that sometimes to just say, like, some of these beginnings are not that unusual compared to what you could do in classrooms. And part of what we really learned, and these are early findings, so forgive the sort of messiness of this, is our educators were incredibly good at what we call remediations, that they were noticing how and what kids were thinking about and really actually helped reframe them. And it really was about our Indigenous educators being committed to helping young people think from our own knowledge systems and recognize how oftentimes schools have shown them how to think about things that might not be based in Indigenous knowledge systems. And to do this in kind of ethical and loving ways, which I think is a really important difference, that learning how to help young people transition and recognize the kind of navigations they're doing. I think the other thing that we saw is that ICM educators were routinely inviting young people to think towards kind of Indigenous world making and futures about the worlds and the kind of communities and lives that we wanted. That was kind of routine in language. So I'm going to read this to you. So this is a very beginning clip. Again, it's parts of this. I'm going to pull out some segments from this beginning launch. And in this clip, Mia says, so, but what Jenna and I really want to talk to you a little bit about is when we started doing these camps, we met with different families and different elders in the community. And one thing they really wanted to make sure is that we're an intertribal people, not all of us, but there are a lot of us who are not on our original homelands, where our ancestors are from, are not here. But, you know, and a lot of our families, my family too, migrated to these urban places, to Seattle for lots of different reasons. And so one of the things we want to make sure that everyone goes home to and asks, how did your family get to Seattle? And one of the child's, Ross, he's 10, says, well, we didn't really come to Seattle. We came, it's called a big migration, where like the south over by Boston over there, that area was getting packed with people. So we had this huge migration, like the Oregon Trail. That's what we call it now, but we just migrated. And the teacher says, so you're telling me, what tribe are you again? Ross, I'm Yupik. Mia says, you're Yupik. So actually, where are Yupik people from? And Ross says, the north. Yeah, they're way north, right? Ross says, yeah. Mia says, so you probably actually didn't ever start on Boston. Your people were from the north. So, and Ross says, oh yeah, I've never been out of the north area. Mia says, yeah, well, so one of the things that's really important, you want to share something. Sonia, another child, says, I'm also Yupik. I know that some of us started in Alaska. Part of what I want to point out here is that the teacher is actively actually positioning the learning environment as coming from families and community, and us teaching about the things that community thought were important, right? But also that there's some work here happening to not position urban natives as kind of colonized or not on our homeland somehow. It turns out Seattle was always part of our tribal lands until colonialism, just to say. And really this kind of deficit narrative about urban territory. But what is important to also notice is that student heard the word migration from what we would call a colonial paradigm and shares what he thinks the teacher is meaning. I think you want to know about and want to teach me about the Oregon Trail. And this kiddo's assumption that learning environments are teaching from not his perspective is kind of on full display in this moment. And what we see is that actually the teacher remediates him, positions him to answer from who he is as a Yupik person, right? And what happens is that it invites other kiddos immediately to jump in and actually contribute to the conversation. And so when I talk about these remediations and beginnings and helping young people figure out that they can engage, it meant that our teacher needed to notice and be able to detect, like, okay, something is off here. I know this child well enough to know that they're answering from a really colonial paradigm. And once you do, something else opens up. I'm going to keep going. And partly that the teachers continue to talk about actually further talking about migrations as not just being about coloniality. And they talk about, and I'll just read this quick, but Native peoples have always traveled to other people's lands. But here's the thing that's really important. We've usually done that in really good ways. We've done that from a place of respect, and we've sometimes learned, maybe sometimes we needed it for food, for trade. We might trade, or we might trade things that we needed to live, or maybe we traded knowledge. But we traveled and met other people, and we respected each other's homelands. What we see here is the teacher is further saying that actually the temporality of migration is not only on colonial terms. Migrations and travel is something that Native people have always done. And they go on, and she goes on. And part of what I want to, oh, I think I skipped this. After they go this in this beginning, there's this movement towards connecting past generations to future. And in this, before this, they move into the lesson. She talks about, and so then how can we think about what we need to do to make the world we want? What do we want the world to be? She goes on to kind of explain that they had talked to some elders and they had heard about the place that they were in and their history. And the teacher positions two elders that they met with about the history of Daybreak, about how they created this community center and now these kids have this opportunity. And we sort of say they didn't have a place where we can come together and talk about these things and think about what does it mean for us and what do we want to do with it. So we're going to keep thinking about what the world is we want to create. And just to say that part of what's important about this, we think, is that it positions all of these learners as part of generational struggles and legacies of upholding things, right? It connects in the narrative their relationship to the past, to the present, to their elders, and to what their responsibilities are now. So I've been talking longer than I intended to, but what I hope I'm showing you is that these ethics about why is something important, as well as setting up the temporalities in the beginnings, is really, we think, a really critical feature of what it means to start thinking about pedagogical sovereignty and supporting Indigenous youth thriving. So that actually the problems of coloniality don't continue to define every learning experience for young people. So I think I'll stop and take any questions or wonderings.
I have a question. So I've been a paraprofessional for like a really long time, and I'm taking a little bit of a break, but I'm hoping that I'm using this break to go into science teaching. And I know when I go through the licensure um and all of the classes and coursework that I have to take, that I'm going to be um given one kind of framework from the school. Like, well, what's a good way, or do you have any suggestions on investigating this more as a pairing to what I'm learning so that I can keep, keep it fresh? I don't know how to word that, but
Mhm.
I hope you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say the idea of land-based education and helping people understand kind of, there's lots of terms now. Sometimes people call it culturally sustaining. Here's what I would say to you is, as you're doing science education, remember that Native people have always been scientists, that we have robust knowledge systems about our lands and waters, and that it wasn't invented with Western scientists figuring out what's real. That, like, I used to have it when I was getting my graduate degree. I was like, we were the first scientists, we have robust knowledges, and to kind of keep yourself thinking about that. I think the other thing that I would say, there's actually tons of great resources online increasingly. Like if you just Googled land-based education, all of our iSteam stuff is there, but there are a lot of people really trying to continue to build out what does it look like to develop land-based education. I think the other thing is that this piece about where you start with stories is really thinking about, as you get trained, about how do you start? Because as you get that, teacher education teaches people, where do you start a lesson? How do you start? What are the beginnings? And I would continue to really think about, what are the assumptions there? My fast way of doing some of this with teacher educators, pre-service teacher educators, and this is dating myself a little bit, and I don't use drugs or alcohol anymore, but I imagine many of you will remember the game 6 Degrees of Separation from Kevin Bacon, which was that drinking game in college that was like, can you name a movie and then see how Kevin Bacon was connected to it? You don't know it, but anyway, partly what I've told educators is, when you make a lesson plan, do the work of saying, why does it matter? And how's it connected to your kids, families, and communities, both now, in the past, and in the future? And just getting in that habit of doing that for yourself is helpful. And if you can't, you might start to be like, wait, why are we teaching this? But I think what also happens from that very simple practice is that kids get told they're entitled to know that they're entitled to know, why does this matter for my life? And I think as a teacher, if you continue to think about, like, that's actual intellectual dignity. Those are what Deloria talks about, those conditions for learning what we want. And to me, that's one of those key things, that if you begin there, the long-term benefit is kind of profound.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. I appreciate everything. Thank you.
I'm going to put, I'm going to put 2 links to a whole bunch of resources that you all can grab. All of the work that we do is free. It's online. We have free PDs that we offer in ongoing ways. Here's Indigenous STEAM. And then I'll also, there's another project that is, for some of you, you may not have a classroom that is majority Indigenous children. We have a project called Learning in Places that is deliberately trying to support educators doing this kind of work with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids. And it's called Learning in Places, and it's there. I see also someone else asking for my PowerPoint. You are more than welcome to have it. If you all send me an email, I will happily share it with you.
I have a question.
Mhm.
In my role as a behavior specialist, would it be appropriate to use stories in that we're restorative and we do the restorative questioning, and in the teaching, would it be appropriate to use stories for the understanding of behavior?
So I would say 100% yes. But the question is what's your relationship to the stories and where do you get them? So part of what I think is really important as educators is to think about, if we think about stories as really important for Indigenous knowledge systems, we have to have a relationship to the story and know where it's coming from. Many tribal communities will share stories that are appropriate, for sure. And we do that a lot, actually. So in our programs, about 40% of kids are in foster care, and anywhere between 40 and 65 have 65% of our kids have IEPs. And we don't have behavioral issues in our programs. And part of why I think that is because we start to help understand how to structure learning environments that actually don't have the same demands as schools. And we provide language about roles and responsibilities. So we're outside all day with kids. We have 2 rules: be respectful and keep each other safe.
Yep, thank you.
You know, my storyteller that has been a mentor for me would also say that children that know our traditional stories, they help us make sense of those hard questions, right? And so while I've shown you kind of the grandmother cedar helped with complex forest ecosystem stories, it also teaches about what it looks like to show kindness and to reciprocate with kindness and care, right? And there are lots of ways that I think my teachers have at least taught me that those stories help those young people who are struggling to figure out the purpose of things. It helps them with framework. So I think it's a really beautiful possibility.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Tasha, did I say your name right?
Yeah, that was good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just curious. We're in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and my daughter, I mean, there's not a lot of opportunities for her to access this sort of knowledge within the classroom that she's in right now. It's very, they're dissecting frogs right now, and yeah, you know where I'm going with this. So just wondering, for your program or as an educator, how would you go about challenging those
Yeah.
curriculum deliverables, or giving her a route to plow it through, spending time on the land with, do you have any advice for that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we do here is that we're deliberate about bringing community together to dream about educational possibility collectively. One of the things that schools do is they set up a spoke model, right? Where educators are doing one-on-one with one kid and their family, or that there's not really a collective in the same kind of way. And part of the reason, so I would tell you that kids doing cool work with other kids matters a lot for their identity over time. It also turns out gives you a political base to challenge things. If you've organized a group of families or community members to want something different rather than solo missioning it, and it kind of helps young people speak together. So why we do this, like, let's come together and think about this, is partly because I think it helps. If you're the only one dissecting frogs and having a problem with it, it could be a pretty lonely space, especially, I bet she's middle school, 7th, 8th, maybe 9th grade.
10th grade, yeah.
Okay. So, that's a hard place to be, but if you open up the space for multiple kids to have the conversation, there's movement that way. So that's one thing I would say. I think the other is, for ICE team, what we had is lots of families who felt like, well, my kid I don't know that I can do this in my school. So we produced a whole bunch of family-based materials to help kids start to see it and feel it and experience it, and then be able to speak to their teachers about it in a different kind of way. So that's the other thing on that ICE Team website. There's all these just family, they're pretty simple, but they help families start to have the conversation. So young people feel like they can respond in a different kind of way as well. I would say there's another thing, you know, for me, I try to be generous with educators that haven't had opportunities to think differently about things. And that's usually my first place. And I also think that there are people who are really committed to pretty racist ideas about Indigenous knowledge systems, and that there's one right way to know the natural world. So I also think sometimes what we need to do for young people is help them see it and name it clearly, and teach them that this is not the place to sink in. So I don't, right, like there's multiple pathways forward, and figuring out the one that helps them in the long run is sometimes the most important thing.
Thank you, Marcy.
Any other questions? Wonderings, worries? I might tell you, for those of you who are educators in classrooms, taking kids outside for the first time is not magic. It doesn't go beautifully the first time. And here's what I'll say that is, kids have been taught that outside, if they're in a schooling context, that outside is a place for play. Maybe kids get recess, right? That actually learning how to learn outdoors again, particularly in school-based contexts, takes some time. And in my experience for educators, myself included, we start to read kid behavior from within the four walls of a school building. And you have to learn new kind of classroom management practices, and kids have to learn how to learn outside again. So I also want to say, if you all try it and you do it once and it's a disaster, I'd encourage you to try it at least 7 more times, and to set up some clear expectations, and to know that kid engagement behavior doesn't look the same as you might want it to in a classroom. I work with a scientist who's kind of a spaz, to be honest. She's very loud. She gets super excited about little bugs, and will be outside and she'll notice something and she'll be like, oh my God, come here, come look at this. And I've watched classroom after classroom of a kid who's that excited tell them they're being disruptive because they got really loud and yelled. Or that a kid outside who is moving really rapidly between noticing things can be seen as not focused. So there's all these kinds of ways that when we start to change our learning environment, kid behavior also changes, meaning their engagement, their interests, their emotion might shift too. So I'll tell people, we're going to try it, be committed to multiple times. And if your first one goes badly, that's probably all right. All right. Well, it is 5 o'clock here. I put my email in there. Totally happy to be in touch. If I can help with anything, please feel free. Email me, websites. Love to hear from you all.
Miigwech.
Miigwech. Nice to see a couple of you that I know well already. I see your names. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
All right. Igwabamin.